shift gears a little bit here and have by Ashley Lear, who is a professor of humanities at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, where she teaches courses in American and Russian literature, dystopian fiction, science fiction, and video game narratives. Her book, The Remarkable Kinship of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings and Ellen Glasgow, is available from the University Press of Florida. She's currently researching the lives of women astronomers through the lens of Adrienne Rich's poetry, and has a forthcoming article in Acta Astronomica entitled "A Woman in the Snow Among the Clocks and Instruments: How Adrienne Rich reimagined the lives of women astronomers." This is Ashley Lear.
Maybe it won't pop so much for me, but I promised David Nolan I would speak really loudly so you can hear me back there, right, David? So this presentation is actually a little late coming because my book, The Remarkable Kinship of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings and Ellen Glasgow, came out in 2017. And I actually was going to present on it at the conference that got canceled that was supposed to be in St. Augustine back during COVID. And since then, though, I have put this presentation together for the Florida Heritage Book Festival, and also as part of the Florida Humanities Council kind of speaking tour thing. So I've presented this many, many times at this point to different museums and libraries and things over the years. But in case you're not familiar, my book was actually inspired when I moved to Florida to take my job at Embry-Riddle. I had written my dissertation on Ellen Glasgow, and it's funny being here because many people don't know who Ellen Glasgow was, and she was my inspiration really in my dissertation. And when I moved here, I was presenting on some of my Ellen Glasgow research when Denny Bowden, who used to be a member of this society for many years, was at my presentation, and Denny said, "Well, have you been to the University of Florida archives yet?" I was like, "Well, no." And he said, "Well, you need to go visit the Rawlings archive." Why would it, she sounds interesting. He said, "Well, she was writing the biography of Ellen Glasgow when she died, and you can find a lot of material there." And sure enough, I traveled to UF. I met Flo. She took me out to Burrito Brothers for lunch, which is, we all miss Burrito Brothers, right? Was a wonderful place. And I just started diving into that archive and kind of got the idea that at first I was thinking of trying to write the biography that Rawlings didn't finish because she had all this really interesting access. Because Rawlings had been so close with Glasgow, after Ellen Glasgow died, the family welcomed her in. Her literary executor actually brought her in, introduced her around, gave her very personalized access to people who spoke to her in very candid ways they would not have spoken to anyone else about the life of Ellen Glasgow. And she also had access to Glasgow's autobiography, which was set to not be published until the last living person referenced in it had passed away, because Ellen Glasgow did not want to offend any living persons. But she was able to read it, so she had access to all these materials, and the archive there at UF has all these really interesting materials. And when I started setting about this, I really got interested more in the friendship between these two women and the experience of women as writers during this period. So many, we saw the pictures of Edith Pope earlier. We're looking at connections with Margaret Mitchell. I think that many of us look, and Anna Lilios' book on Zora Neale Hurston, there are these connections between women writers during this period that have always fascinated me, the way they inspire one another, the way that they work together, and not just, even when they write very different types of fiction, they're inspired by one another. And if you look at Ellen Glasgow and Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, they're a great example of how you wouldn't normally put them together. Their fiction is extremely different. In fact, before they became friends, they both wrote fairly derogatory comments about one another's work. I think Glasgow once wrote that South Moon Under, the characters read as if they were made of wool. Was her, yes, she did not like that one. And Rawlings said to Max Perkins that she had never enjoyed any of Ellen Glasgow's fiction, but that her writing about writing, which was a certain measure, she had a book of writing about writing, that had been very inspirational and that she had felt a very close connection to the writing process. So The two began corresponding after Glasgow wrote to Rawlings in praise of the yearling, which she had loved. She was a big animal rights activist and really loved the tale of the yearling. And then they kept corresponding. And their correspondence was kept alive in part because of a couple of people you've heard mentioned today. Barbara Wingo was presenting about James Branch Cabell, the crazy Richmond writer. He actually lived in the same neighborhood as Ellen Glasgow in Richmond. And when he would come down, he would talk her up to Rawlings. Oh, she just loves you. You need to get her to come down here to visit because Glasgow's health was failing, and he thought Florida weather would be good for her. She never made it down, but Rawlings did make it to Richmond to visit her, and they were able to see one another that way. And then Max Perkins also knew both of them. He had tried and not done well editing something by Glasgow, but of course he was Rawlings's editor, and he also wrote very positive things and encouraged the two of them to stay in contact. Today, I've got a whole book on their lives, but today I want to focus on something that's really important to me, and that's the way both of these writers impacted the world around them, not just through their fiction, but through their kind of activism is a word I use here, but really just their influence on social and cultural issues of their day. And they did this not only because of their great talent and skill as writers, they were both very strong, well-recognized writers, but they also used their celebrity status. Both Glasgow and Rawlings were famous writers. Everywhere they went, people knew who they were and respected them. And they used that celebrity status, in addition to their talent as writers, to really make a big impact on different social and cultural issues. So I'm going to talk about some of those today. This is actually a quote from one of Ellen Glasgow's very first short stories, A Woman of Tomorrow. This was written in 1895. So if you don't know the time period, they're about a generation difference between the two women. Ellen Glasgow was the first child in her family born after the American Civil War, and she was born in Richmond, so she grew up in a Reconstruction era Richmond. And when she wrote this story, A Woman of Tomorrow, it's hyphenated like that, she imagined, she was very young, she's like 19 when she wrote this, she imagined the story of Patricia York, who was the very first, in this fictionalized account, woman to be considered as an associate justice of the Supreme Court. And she wrote this story, and it's a really powerful story. And in the story, Patricia York is sitting at her desk at the beginning. She's just gotten this letter. She's just realized she's achieved this thing she's been pursuing her whole life. She's very accomplished. And instead of celebrating this accomplishment, she takes a train back to the small town in Virginia where she was from. And she kind of stands up on this hill and looks down at this house. And in the house was the man, the kind of the lover that she'd had when she was a much younger woman who she'd left to go off and pursue these great achievements. And there's a bedraggled woman outside doing clothes on the line who is presumably this man's wife. And she's looking down at their life, and it's a little rough around the edges, and she's standing there, and you would think she would be proud, like, I escaped that, but instead, there's kind of a bitterness there, and you see this in a lot of Ellen Glasgow's literature. Glasgow never married. She had a few relationships, but they never really amounted to anything. And in this story, she is a little bitter that even though she'd achieved the thing she'd been pursuing her whole life, it came at a cost, and this cost was having to choose between kind of this like romantic love and this vocational pursuit, which is something you can see in a lot of Ellen Glasgow's literature. The characters have to make those choices. In this quote, Glasgow writes, "On one side, all the womanhood within her quivered with desire. On the other, a man's ambitions struggled to survive. It was the new woman warring against the old, the 20th century rebelling against the 19th. So I'm going to start just with a little bit about how Ellen Glasgow kind of inspired or changed the culture of women in literature, women as writers. Ellen Glasgow was writing in the 1890s, all the way through her death in the 1940s. I think her last novel was published maybe posthumously in 51. So she had a very long career as a writer, but when she started, the 1890s was not a great time for women to try and be writers. There were no educational opportunities, first of all, in Reconstruction era Richmond, aside from like a woman's house that ran a little school inside the house, and she went there a couple of days and didn't have the Constitution for it. So Glasgow was mostly trained through her father's library. She read everything she could get her hands on. And one of the black servants, her family had kept the slaves from before the Civil War and hired them after the Civil War ended. After abolition, the servants had been hired into the family and continued working for them. And the woman who had helped to raise her kind of, I guess, the mammy type figure who had raised her, used to tell her stories. And she says in many of her books that that was one of the big inspirations for all these stories she was told as a young child. And she started writing stories and making up stories, and she was scared to show them because she didn't want to be judged for her writing. She didn't want to be criticized. But her sister, Carrie McCormick, and Carrie's husband, Walter, really encouraged this, and she and Carrie were very close. And Carrie and Walter together decided to give her the money that she would need to visit a literary agent in New York City. And so she sent her manuscript. Sharper Realities was the first manuscript that she finished. She sent it ahead to this book agent, and along with money, because you had to pay to have an agent read your book. Along with this money, she sent it ahead, and then she planned a secret trip where she was going with friends to see some shows in New York, but secretly she was going to meet with this agent and plan the whole trip with Walter and Carrie's help. She gets up there, and she finally makes it to her appointment with the literary agent. And this is where things went horribly wrong, because she goes into their office. The manuscript is sitting on his desk. It hasn't even been opened. It's still in the wrapping, the typewritten manuscript. And in that meeting, she is sexually assaulted. So a woman traveling alone, I mean, this was not what she had imagined. She ends up writing about that in her biography, The Woman Within. And she gets out, she leaves, goes back to her hotel. She sends a courier for the manuscript, and when she gets it, she throws it in the fire. So no one will ever know Sharper Realities. It's a book that no longer exists. It was the only copy. And she vows she's never going to write again, but writers have a real hard time keeping to their vows. And so she does write again. She writes this book called The Descendant, which was her first published novel. And when she writes The Descendant, she goes about it a little bit differently. She realizes that as a woman, she has to be more careful, that there are dangers out there. And so she starts going through connections. She has a friend of a friend who knew someone, who specifically knew someone at, where is it up here? At Macmillan. So we're gonna go to the second quote. So after the Sharp Realities quote was, "I was bruised, I was disgusted, I was trembling with anger," was what she wrote after that experience. And then a friend of a friend knew someone from Macmillan, which was a big publisher. So she met with Price Collier, and they had lunch, and she had a letter of introduction, and so she thought this was going to go well. Again, he didn't even read the manuscript. He said, I really don't read things by women. He told her that she should stop writing, go back to the South, and have some babies. So that didn't work out really well. And then finally she gets her big break with her third connection, her third attempt, and that was through a University of Virginia economics professor of all things. Her brother-in-law, Walter McCormick, was an economist, and she would often go to these university engagements, even though women were not permitted at UVA at the time. This was before women were allowed at the university. She was interested in economics. She was a big student of Adam Smith and of Karl Marx. She actually has a whole essay on Marxism, which is really interesting to read. But she would talk to this economics professor, and she told him what she was trying to do. And he said, well, I've only ever published textbooks, but I can introduce you to my contact. So he introduced her to someone at University Publishing Company, which dealt with textbooks. But he was so well-renowned that they gave her manuscript to a very young, brand new editor with University Publishing House, one Mr. Patton, and he actually read The Descendant. And The Descendant was kind of about that. It was a young poor man from Virginia, moves to New York. He starts writing for a communist press magazine in New York, and then he becomes very wealthy because he's a really good writer, and then he finds himself kind of in this weird space where he's trying to get labor unions started, but he actually has money now, and it's like, and he's conflicted. It's a great book, The Descendant. But he reads it, and he said, he compared her to Victor Hugo and wrote, "This book shall be published if I have to build a publishing house in order to publish it." And he advocated for her, but his advocacy encouraged her to publish it anonymously. He said, "There's no way as a woman you're going to publish this novel." So she did. She published it anonymously. It came out. The reviews were outstanding. Everyone loved it, and because of its very controversial subject matter, people kept trying to guess what famous author had written it under an anonymous author's name because they didn't want to be tied to this controversy. And after it's on the bestseller list, after she's given all these accolades, she re-releases the next edition of it immediately with her name and a portrait of her in the cover piece that is overly feminized. I mean, she is like just gloves and hats and shoes. I mean, everything. She's like to make her look as feminine as possible was the goal there. This is not the actual photo is a kind of a full length, and you can see her full dress and everything. And it's really funny, if you read the reviews before and after she came out as a woman, it's hilarious. Like, it's like virile and vigorous over here, and then over here it's like, you would never imagine from the small size of her feet that such a woman could, like, it's like a lot of discussions about her small feet in the post-author name reviews. But what I think is beautiful about this is that it's writers like Glasgow that really open up the field of literature to women after them, like Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. They really, they took the risks and they had to kind of forge a path. And I think that we can really see the efforts and the sacrifices that writers like Ellen Glasgow made in order to allow this professional opportunity for other women. Rawlings was able to go to college. She went to University of Wisconsin in Madison. She was able to become educated. She was publishing stories in high school in the local paper. I mean, she didn't have these same types of struggles that Ellen Glasgow had. But I will say that Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings also opened paths for women, and not just in the literary world. So when Rawlings graduated from the University of Wisconsin, she wanted to be a writer, but you don't just become a novelist. It's not something you do. And so she, like many of her male colleagues, went into journalism. And that was a very common path into the literary community. She began in New York at the YWCA. And if you think about what did she write for the YWCA? She wrote stories about women from the war effort, women in World War I. She wrote about women who were on the front lines of battle, women who were literally in the war effort in ways that women wouldn't normally have been. So she's exposing these stories about women in all of these different professions. And then when she and Chuck Rawlings get married and they move to Louisville, what does she write about in Live Women in Live Louisville, but women who are in predominantly male-occupied professions? Like, she writes about these women who have broken through and had jobs that no other woman has had before, and what their experiences are, and how they got into these fields, and what do they do in their daily life. That was what she wrote about. Again, exposing the ways in which women were entering the workplace. In one of her articles from her time at University of Wisconsin, she wrote, "Success should be waiting with open arms for the determined young woman who studies law, medicine, agriculture, pharmacology, or who takes a commerce course with an eye to big things." So it's this idea, she's also in her career trying to open up professions to women that would not normally be available. So if you go from there, both women did also live through suffrage. It was actually at the very end of Rawlings' college career that suffrage came to pass, and she wrote about it in oh, I don't have that quote on here. Oh, it's on the next slide. All right, I'll read that quote next. But Ellen Glasgow was actually part of this sort of, she was suffrage adjacent, I would say. She wrote about women's suffrage, but didn't participate in the protest. As she wrote, "I was always a feminist, for I liked intellectual revolt as much as I disliked physical violence." So she would never actually show up for a protest, but she was very good friends with people like Mary Johnston, photographed here, who was an American novelist and very famous suffragette, and she promoted them through her own literature. She had a 1913 essay titled "Feminism," in which she wrote, "If as man has so confidently asserted in the past, woman exists not as an active agent of life, but merely as the passive guardian of the life force, then indeed is her revolt doomed to fail and her struggle to bear fruit in her sorrow. If her fight is a fight against law, if it is nature's purpose that woman shall sit and watch, Then as surely as night follows day, she will continue to sit and watch until the end of time. Again, arguing that if it were a woman's nature, she wouldn't be successful, so why not just let women do the thing? So that was one of the things she wrote. She also wrote that suffrage for women is an inevitable fact in the social development of the race, and sentiment is as powerless to stay its coming as it is to stem the advancing tide of evolution. That was in a letter to Mary Johnston in particular. So she really wrote and promoted women's suffrage behind the scenes. This is on race relations. Yeah, this was a different quote. Rawlings did write, in the old order hath changed, that suffrage had at last become a certainty. And that was not in my slide. But that was something that Rawlings wrote in her university magazine right before women's suffrage had come to pass. The next issue, and we've heard a lot actually already on race relations, but these are two really interesting women to study when it comes to race relations, because Ellen Glasgow was born the first child after the American Civil War into a Richmond family that owned the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, so they actually had some money even after the war. And their family had slaves that became servants, and she grew up in a very southern, very specific type of environment. And from a young age, Ellen Glasgow was always a big proponent of improved race relations. Now, a lot of her writing about race takes a very paternalistic approach. She believed in trying to care for the Black people in her community and to protect them from violence and racism that she saw all around her. You can read in her literature, there are depictions of lynchings that she puts in there to try and expose what was happening in Virginia at the time. Her last novel that actually won the Pulitzer, In This Our Life, is the story of a young Black man who is given the blame for manslaughter, basically an automotive accident where a person was killed with a car, and the car was being driven by the young white woman in the household, and they end up blaming this young man, this young Black man who was the son of one of the workers for the family, and he was just about to go to university, had a scholarship to go and get his law degree, and the story follows how the family's decision to blame him for this ends up tearing the family apart and ends up impacting them for generations to come. So, and that was her novel that won the Pulitzer. It was made into a film. But she, in her life, Ellen Glasgow really tried to promote race relations in this paternalistic way by providing higher income. We see this, like she actually paid the people that worked for her a higher salary. She also was a big giver to the African American old folks home in Richmond, which was often left out of a lot of the community trusts and the community movements. She, of all things, cared for the cemetery. There was a separate Black cemetery in Richmond, and she went and took care of it and made sure all the headstones of the family's former slaves and servants were cared for, and that they had fresh flowers, and that the cemetery was beautiful. And then when she died, she actually, in her will, bequeathed a sum that she had left in cash with her secretary to her chef and butler of the time, because she wanted to make sure he was taken care of for the rest of his life. So things like that. Ellen Glasgow wrote, everybody thinks of the children, but these old colored people are so pathetic and neglected. They're not in the community fund, and that was why she made all of her contributions to the Afro-American Old Folks Home in Richmond. And then Emily Clark points out in a 1929 essay that Glasgow capitalized the word Negro in as early as in 1904 with her novel The Deliverance. And this was something we still see to this day, this idea of capitalizing, even when we talk about the Black community, capitalizing the word Black as an actual, a group, an ethnic group that needs to be capitalized. Like that's it's a big thing. So she, in 1904, was capitalizing the word Negro when other people were not, and using that in that way. And that was overwhelmingly progressive because, as Emily Clark writes, it asserted the advancement of the race into one whose name was worthy of capitalization, something not yet done by the majority of the writers. We've already heard a lot about Rawlings' views on race, so I'm not going to repeat what has been said already by Anne and by Barbara, but I can give a little bit more information, which is that a couple of other inspirations. She also heard Mary McLeod Bethune-Cookman speak at the University of Florida. That was another inspirational, in addition to her friendship with Zora Neale Hurston, which helped to change her views on race. She found that Mary McLeod Bethune-Cookman had really interesting ideas about education. So if you are looking to see whether she provided any scholarship funds, that might be a good place to look, because the Bethune-Cookman still has the historically black college in Daytona Beach, which was at that time, I think, just a secondary school. I think Mary McLeod Bethune-Cookman, it didn't become a college or university until a little bit later. She also went and spoke at Fisk University in Tennessee, which is another HBCU, and made huge headway by staying at the home of the university president, a black man, while she was speaking at the university in Tennessee. That was a time where that was extremely progressive and was kind of a big risk and a big show of support on her behalf. As many people noted, one of her reasons to step back and not say as much about race, even when her views changed, was because of the lawsuit, the invasion of privacy lawsuit. She was actually ashamed of the fact that she was worried that speaking about race might impact the way that the lawsuit came out. She did write in 1943, I have forced myself to take the final mental leap about the Negroes. There is no question but that we must go all out for full equality, meaningless though the phrase may be. Anything else is the height of hypocrisy. But then I have to also balance that with Adela Parker, her perfect maid, writing, was she a racist? Not consciously, I think. She was a product of the time she lived in. Rawlings did. She also wrote articles about the segregated beaches. There's one article about a black woman who was detained after being on a white beach where she was working as a nanny for a wealthy white family that was visiting down there, and Rawlings actually wrote an editorial about that. And she also wrote to get bus routes to areas of the creek so that some of the black, or specifically one black child who was not able to go to school because of missing bus routes, she wrote an article to try and help make sure that that bus route would allow for that child to go to school. So she did some smaller things too to kind of help race relations. Both writers, I would say, had the greatest impact in their literature with exposing class issues, economic class issues in the South, specifically among the poor white community. Ellen Glasgow's novels Barren Ground and Vein of Iron both take place in Appalachia, so they're kind of writing about the same people, because it's the poor white Scotch-Irish people from Appalachia who moved to Florida and become the crackers. We see that kind of continuation. They're just on different geographical regions when they're writing about them. Ellen Glasgow's novels were focused on people who were land poor, a social class unit which Glasgow writes, though it has been consistently ignored alike by Southern literature and tradition, has borne a liberal part in the making of Southern history. And these were people who owned land, but as she writes in Barren Ground, the land was full of broom sedge. It produced nothing. So they have all of this property, all of this land, and yet they have no food. They're very, very poor. And these are the stories that she kind of covered in Barren Ground and Vein of Iron. And she and Rawlings both felt that these individuals living in these impoverished circumstances had a universal truth to express about human nature and human experience, and that if they could tell these stories in the right way, we could all learn more about our kind of universal human experience. And this kind of gets into that cosmic consciousness that Ann and I both love. This idea is kind of that there is something genuine in these stories that gets lost when we go into kind of society and civilization. So it's a romantic ideal. If you're, it's very, very transcendental, very American ideal. But both of them felt that by writing about these people, they could somehow uncover some kind of truth. Now, Glasgow also wrote in What I Believe, this is one of her Marxist essays as well, I believe that the private ownership of wealth should be curbed, that our means of distribution should be readjusted to our increasing needs, and the hollow cry of overproduction banished from a world in which millions are starving. And then Rawlings, when she was writing on the Crackers, was actually worried at some point that people reading the novels, like South Moon Under, would read it more as spectacle than what she wanted. She wanted it it to be this great novel about humans and about their experiences, and she felt others would read it as kind of a spectacle about these poor people in Florida. And she wrote a letter along those lines to Max Perkins when she writes, after reading reviews of South Moon Under, she felt quite cheap, quite the Judas, at having apparently delivered the cracker into the hands of the Philistines. So she kind of struggled with that too, but both of them did end up writing works that really kind of exposed and helped that. Both Rawlings and Glasgow lived through world wars. In fact, Ellen Glasgow, she had a fiance who went off into World War I and became enamored with Queen Marie of Romania. And if you know anything about Queen Marie of Romania, she really got around. Henry Anderson isn't even mentioned in her list of lovers on her Wikipedia page, in case you were curious. But Henry Anderson fell madly in love with Queen Marie of Romania, had a portrait above his, and Glasgow was so upset when he broke off the engagement that she tried to kill herself. That was she had a suicide attempt around that time. Ellen Glasgow was not really, she did not like war. She thought that war was senseless, that violence was senseless, and she really would not have supported any kind of war. Two of her great quotes are, "Generals may not mind the men they kill, but they should at least consider the beauty they destroy." And she also wrote, "In war there's only one sin, cruelty. Everything else could be called an error in manners." But she really was kind of opposed to all war. And Rawlings, however, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings during World War II had Norton Baskin off at the war, and she really became a huge proponent of the war effort and trying to help the soldiers in various and sundry ways. This is a picture of Norton Baskin when he worked for the American Field Service as an ambulance driver in India, and we learned last night at the trustee dinner that he said he would take a job with him and he would not hold a gun. Like, it was that he said that anything where he didn't have to hold a gun. So what Rawlings did, some of her efforts, in addition to writing to all the servicemen, which Barbara told you about, she had to answer all those letters. Another thing you can find if you go visit Flo in the archives are these Emily Post-style letters to the troops. And these are some of my favorites. These are hilarious. And they're very bawdy. They're very, and she doesn't put her name on them. They're signed Emily Post. But it's kind of like Emily Post levels about marriage, but they're really risque, and there's a lot of toilet humor and a lot of sexual humor in them. And she wrote these to entertain the troops, and they would get published in the newsletter or whatever the troops had there. She worked from Crescent Beach as a volunteer aircraft spotter and also raised funds and purchased bonds. She'd actually gone back to Cross Creek to try and work more on the Sojourner, but ended up writing all these letters to servicemen and didn't end up working much. And that was in part also because they released versions of her books, which you can also see in the archive with Flo. There were specific editions to be put in the pocket. There were service editions, pocket editions, the Armed Forces editions, and her books were printed in that format, so they were distributed very widely. And because of that, she got a lot of letters from people, from men writing to her from the war. And those are the ways that she supported them. Both writers had their pet projects related to the environment. Ellen Glasgow was actually the founder of the Richmond SPCA, one of the first SPCAs in the country. This is the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. In fact, Ellen Glasgow left her entire literary estate to the Richmond SPCA. So if you buy a novel by Ellen Glasgow, the proceeds go to the Richmond SPCA because they own the literary rights to all of her manuscripts. She was a huge proponent. She had dogs, she had cats. When she did write with Rawlings, they would often write about the animals. She would, I think at one point, one of them sent a cat to the other one. They were always talking and writing about these animals. She made sure that bird feed got left out for the birds in the winter in Richmond, and wrote very adamant editorials against these young people who were shooting the birds with their slingshots and BB guns, and was very angry about that. And Anne Virginia Bennett, who was her secretary, her personal secretary, shared this poem with Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings when she was visiting her, and said it was one of the last things that she and Ellen Glasgow read together before Glasgow died. And it's a poem by Jane Stephen, who is a British writer. Little things that run and quail and die in silence and despair. Little things that fight and fail and fall on the earth and sea and air. All trapped and frightened little things. The mouse, the coney, hear our prayer. As we forgive those done to us, the lamb, the linnet, and the hare. Forgive us all our trespasses, little creatures everywhere. And that you can find a copy of that poem also in the Rawlings archive dedicated to Ellen Glasgow. Now, we all know that Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings cared a great deal for the environment. She did a lot of conservation work. She wrote against the timber industry, the timber industry, especially in the Panhandle, where they were cutting down lots and lots of trees, and she wrote against that. She also wrote a review of the Everglades by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas the day before. I think her review came out almost the day before it got established as a national park. So she was part of that effort with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and wrote a nice review of that book at the time. She wrote, "Those of us who prefer Florida's lush wildness to profitable commercialization regret the increasing so-called development, but it would be selfish to deny a share in the bland sunshine and the enjoyment of palm trees, the exotic birds, the fishing and the hunting to transients. And it is only to be hoped that while more and more travelers come inevitably to the state, the natural beauties, the native flora and fauna will be preserved." And that was in Florida, Land of Contrast. So she really tried to preserve the natural landscape of Florida as well. So I'm hoping this kind of gives you an idea of different ways that they didn't just write literature, but they also used that literature and also used their voices to promote other issues in the world around them in some fairly significant ways. And I want to end with this poem that I think really speaks to where I started this talk, which is on the way that women writers would often support one another and often found this camaraderie among one another that was very supportive and very uplifting. And this is a 1912 poem that I like to end on by Ellen Glasgow. It's titled "The Call." And in this poem, Glasgow writes, "Woman called to woman at the daybreak, when the bosom of the deep was stirred. In the gold of dawn and in the silence, woman called to woman and was heard. Steadfast as the dawning of the pole star, secret as the fading of the breath, at the gate of birth we stood together, still together, at the gate of death. Queen or slave or bond or free we battled, bartered not our faith for love or gold. Man we served, but in the hour of anguish, woman called to woman as of old. Hidden at the heart of earth we waited, watchful, patient, silent, secret, true. All the terrors of the chains that bound us, man has seen, but only woman knew. Woman knew, yea, still, and woman knoweth. Thick the shadows of our prison lay, yet that knowledge in our hearts we treasure till the dawning of the perfect day. Onward now, as in the long dim ages, onward to the light where freedom lies. Woman calls to woman to awaken. Woman calls to woman to arise." I took it out, now I can't get it back in. Maybe this way. Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Ashley? That was fantastic.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead,
So,
Terry.
Ashley, you mentioned that she was against the timber industry in the Panhandle, and maybe this is a question for Dr. Wingo. I think one of her slides showed Jessie Ball DuPont at the beach house. I wonder if she knew, she must have known that Jessie Ball's brother was the famous Ed Ball, who orchestrated the entire timber industry in
Yeah,
the
she
Panhandle.
hasn't. Her essay against the kind of overcutting of trees is in the uncollected works, that collection. Yeah, it's that Roger and Bryn did. If you want to look up that essay, but yeah, her essay it takes place in kind of the Suwannee River area. But yeah, I don't know if she knew.
Well, I mean, Ed Ball was a huge figurehead at that time, so everybody in the state knew who Ed Ball was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody knew.
Did you know Rachel Carson? Wasn't Rachel Carson in the original?
Silent Spring.
She knew of Rachel. Did Rawlings know Rachel Carson? I think she knew of her. I'm not sure if they had a personal acquaintance. I'll look that up.
I didn't come across that in my research, so I don't know. Flo would be a better person to know that. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I noticed that although Marjorie had these views, she had to pay her dues too, starting off, because she, while she was working for the newspaper, had to write songs in the housewife about.
Yeah, I skipped over that one. I don't know if you noticed, I skipped over that one in my
All
slide.
those things that she had to do to pay her dues to get
Yeah.
there, she had to, even though she felt one way, she had to act because it was the time.
One of the many reasons why they wanted to leave Rochester. Yes, Ellen.
It always amazed me that they were more active in the suffrage, in women's suffrage. Did you find that to be sort of contradictory? They had all these other things going on, but the vote did seem to be very, very important.
Yeah, I don't know, for Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, I really don't know any, like, she really is, other than that one, the Old Order half, which was her University of Wisconsin article, that's the only thing I found her writing at all on women's suffrage. Glasgow wrote a lot more about it, but she didn't participate in the activism because she didn't like to be out in public. Like, she didn't like the physical protests and presence. She preferred to be a writer behind the scenes. As she writes, the intellectual revolt was more interesting to her. She liked theorizing and writing arguments for and arguments to explain and things like that. That was more interesting. The rhetoric of it was much more interesting to her than the activism.
That's something.
Yeah.
And then I was wondering about her, I mean, would you have called her a card-carrying communist?
I would not have called her. I think she would have called herself a Marxist. But then it's interesting to say, yeah, she would call herself a Marxist, but if you look at where and how she lived,
I know.
it's the same. She wasn't necessarily living the lifestyle of a Marxist while being a proponent of those views.
Right.
So yeah.